As the book of Exodus begins, 400 years have passed, and the new Pharaoh doesn't remember Joseph. In fact, nobody does. The new Pharaoh looks upon God's family, Israel, the descendants of Abraham, and enslaves them. And we're left wondering, what about God's promises to Abraham? Sure, the people are many, but slavery? That doesn't seem like a blessing. And it's then that God raises up another broken person. Moses, a murderer in fact, and God says to Moses in Exodus chapter 6, I will free you from being slaves to the Egyptians. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with mighty acts of judgment, and I will take you to the land that I swore with uplifted hand to give to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob. I will give it to you as a possession. I am the Lord, he says. And God's word does not return void. He keeps his promise. He frees them from slavery with mighty acts of judgment, the plagues, and ultimately the Passover. And after exiting Egypt, the Israelites then find themselves at the base of Mount Sinai. And it's there in Exodus chapter 19, verse 6, that God sets them apart as a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. But these people, all they'd ever known was life in chains and slavery. They didn't know what it was like to do life in their newfound freedom or to walk out in this new identity. And part of being set apart is living differently. And that's why God gave Israel the law, instructions for living life in light of this new identity. But the law, it was also revelatory. It taught them about who they were in light of who God was, holy. And this holy God also instructed them to build the tabernacle, which was more like a tent, but nevertheless, God wanted to be with them as they traveled to the land that he had promised them. But we run into a problem, because in Exodus chapter 34, verses 6 through 7, God says that he's gracious and merciful and all these awesome things, but he's also just. And remember Genesis 3? Moses is a broken, sinful human being who can't be in the presence of God. In fact, they have built the tabernacle, but as the book of Exodus ends, we see that Moses is unable to enter. And that's where the book of Leviticus comes into play. The way to a holy God and the way to walk with a holy God. And after several pages of priestly law, we find ourselves in the book of Numbers, where Moses is able to meet with God in the tent. The book of Leviticus worked. God's word didn't return void. And so with that, they head out to the promised land. But God says it will be the next generation of Israelites to enter the land. Why? Well, the second they hit the road, things start to go south. The people start complaining. It'd be better to be back in slavery, they said. But nevertheless, they get to the edge of the promised land, finally, and they send 12 spies into the land. 2 come back and say, yes, God has promised us this land, we can enter. But 10 say, hey, there's giants in the land, and this is a horrible idea, we should not go in. They don't trust God's word. And so they decide not to. In fact, they say that it would have been better for them to have died in slavery than to go into this land that God has promised. And God says to them, you want to die, then die you will, wandering in the wilderness. And so with that, they begin to travel again. And that generation of Israelites spends the rest of their lives wandering through the wilderness. But as the old generation dies off, the new generation of Israelites begin to rise up. And as they're wandering, they start to encounter other nations, and they begin to develop a reputation for themselves. And one leader in particular, Balak, hears that the Israelites are heading his way, and he panics. So he tries to hire a guy to curse them. But remember God's promises to Abraham? Blessing? This guy, Balak, he couldn't speak curses over Israel. He could only speak blessing. And in Numbers chapter 24, he says, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. The star shall rise out of Jacob, and the scepter shall rise out of Israel. Remember the last time we heard about the scepter back in Genesis when Jacob was speaking a word of blessing to Judah? These references are telling us something. All the while, God was on the move. Jesus has always been his plan A. But eventually, this new generation of Israelites finds themselves back at the edge of the promised land. And it's there that the book of Deuteronomy picks up.